Red warning lights flashed across the immigration terminal as another cargo vessel approached Orbital Station Gamma 7, one of the busiest checkpoints between human and Altarian space territories. Border Officer Kalen adjusted his uniform collar and prepared for what would likely be another routine inspection, though something about this particular ship's flight pattern seemed unusual. The vessel docked with a heavy metallic thud that resonated through the station's hull, and Kalen watched through the reinforced viewing window as a human female emerged from the airlock. She moved with the practiced efficiency of an experienced pilot, but there was something in her posture that suggested urgency, perhaps even desperation. Amy Reed checked her chronometer for the third time in 2 minutes, knowing that every second counted. The medical supplies in her cargo hold were desperately needed at New Haven Colony, where a bacterial plague had been spreading rapidly through the population for the past week, and the delay at this checkpoint could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of people. Kalen activated his workstation terminal and began the standard security protocols, his pale blue fingers dancing across the holographic interface with mechanical precision. After 15 years of border enforcement, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot irregularities in documentation, and his reputation for thoroughness had earned him both respect and fear among the smugglers and traders who frequented this route. Documentation and cargo manifest, Kalen stated in his typical monotone voice as Amy approached his desk, not bothering to look up from his screen. His species, the Altarians, were known for their logical approach to problem-solving and their strict adherence to established procedures, traits that made them excellent administrators but sometimes lacking in what humans called compassion. Amy placed her identification chip and cargo documentation on the scanner pad, trying to keep her voice steady despite the anxiety building in her chest. "Officer, I need to inform you that this is an emergency medical transport to New Haven Colony. They're dealing with a serious outbreak and these supplies are critical. All vessels are processed according to standard procedure regardless of claimed urgency," Kalen interrupted, his yellow eyes finally meeting hers with cold efficiency. "Please remain silent while I review your documentation." The scanner began its work, cross-referencing Amy's credentials against multiple databases while simultaneously analyzing the molecular composition of her cargo containers. Kalen's expression remained neutral as the various systems completed their scans, but Amy noticed a slight tension in his jaw when one of the alerts began flashing on his screen. "There appears to be a discrepancy in your medical transport license," Kalen announced after several minutes of tense silence. "The authorization code shows an expiration date that conflicts with our central registry, and the molecular signature of your cargo containers indicates the presence of compounds not listed on your manifest." Amy's heart sank as she realized what must have happened. "Officer, that's because some of the antibiotics were reformulated. At the last minute when we discovered the specific bacterial strain affecting the colony, the research facility updated the compounds, but the paperwork system probably hasn't caught up yet. Irregularities in documentation cannot be overlooked, regardless of the explanation provided," Kalen stated firmly, his voice carrying the weight of countless similar decisions. "Regulations clearly state that any discrepancy between declared cargo and actual molecular analysis results in mandatory quarantine and full inspection procedures. The full inspection process would take a minimum of 72 hours, and Amy knew that New Haven Colony didn't have that kind of time. Already, reports from the colony indicated that the medical facilities were overwhelmed and the death toll was climbing rapidly, particularly among the elderly and children who were most vulnerable to the bacterial infection. "Please, Officer Kalen," Amy said, reading his name badge and trying to inject as much sincerity into her voice as possible. "I understand you have protocols to follow, but people are dying while we speak. Can't you make an exception just this once or at least expedite the inspection? Process somehow." Kalen's expression hardened further at what he perceived as an attempt to manipulate him through emotional appeal. In his experience, humans were notorious for using such tactics to circumvent proper procedures, and he had trained himself to be immune to their theatrical displays of distress. "The regulations exist for the protection of both our species and the maintenance of order in this sector," he replied coldly. "Exceptions cannot be made based Unemotional arguments or unverified claims of emergency. If your cargo is truly what you claim it to be, then you should have ensured proper documentation before departing. Amy felt her composure beginning to crack under the pressure of knowing what was at stake. You don't understand. My brother lives on that colony. He sent me a message yesterday, saying that children are dying because they don't have enough medicine. How can you sit there and talk about paperwork when real people need help? Personal connections do not override security protocols, Kaylin responded, without a trace of sympathy. If you wish to proceed, you must either submit to the full inspection, process, or take an alternate route that does not require passage through Altarian space. The alternate route would add at least 4 days to her journey, winding around the edge of Altarian territory through a series of smaller checkpoints and potentially dangerous regions of space. Amy knew that New Haven Colony couldn't survive that kind of delay, not with the infection spreading as rapidly. As the reports indicated, 4 extra days will kill hundreds of people, Amy said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. How can you live with yourself knowing that your rigid adherence to bureaucracy is going to result in unnecessary deaths? Kaylin stood up from his desk, his tall frame towering over the human woman as he prepared to end this increasingly unpleasant encounter. Your emotional outburst confirms my assessment that this inspection requires full protocols. Please return to your vessel and prepare for either quarantine procedures or departure through alternate routes. Amy stared at him for a long moment, her hands clenched into fists as she struggled between her desire to continue arguing and her knowledge that further protests would only make the situation worse. Finally, she turned and walked back toward her ship, knowing that she had no choice but to take the long route and pray that she wouldn't arrive too late. As her vessel undocked and disappeared into the star-filled darkness beyond the station, Kaylin returned to his desk and filed the incident report, with the same mechanical precision he applied to all his duties. In his mind, he had done exactly what his training and regulations required, maintaining the security and order that kept this sector of space functioning smoothly, despite the constant pressure from various species trying to bend or break the established rules. The next ship in the queue was already approaching the docking bay, and Kaylin prepared himself for another routine inspection, completely unaware that his decision would soon have consequences far beyond what he could imagine. 5 days later, the morning shift briefing at Orbital Station Gamma 7 began with what Commander Roth considered routine administrative updates. But the third item on the agenda would change everything for Border Officer Kaylin. News feeds from the outer colonies had been reporting on various outbreaks and emergencies, the kind of information that typically remained background noise in the constant flow of intergalactic communications. Officer Kaylin, I want to commend you on your handling of the medical transport situation last week, Commander Roth announced. As the briefing began, his gravelly voice carrying across the small conference room. Your adherence to protocol prevented what could have been a serious security breach, and your report has been forwarded to headquarters as an example of proper procedure implementation. Kaylin nodded acknowledgement, feeling the familiar satisfaction that came from receiving recognition for his professional competence. However, something in the commander's tone suggested there was more to this commendation than simple praise, and the way his colleagues were avoiding eye contact made him increasingly uncomfortable. The wall screen activated, displaying the latest news feed from the Human Colonial Network, and Kaylin felt his stomach drop as he saw the headline, New Haven Colony Death Toll Reaches 847 as Medical Supplies Arrive Too Late. The reporter's voice filled the room with details that made every word feel like a physical blow to his chest. The ride, bacterial outbreak that devastated New Haven Colony over the past week, claimed the lives of nearly 900 colonists, including 237 children under the age of 12, the reporter continued. Medical experts confirm that the casualties could have been prevented if critical antibiotic supplies had arrived within the original time frame, but transportation delays forced the medicine to take a longer route through space. Commander Roth paused the broadcast and turned to face his officers, his expression unreadable. The Human Diplomatic Corps has filed a formal complaint regarding our handling of their emergency medical transport. They claim that unnecessary bureaucratic delays directly contributed to the loss of life on New Haven Colony. The room fell silent as the weight of the accusation settled over everyone present, but Kalen felt as though the floor beneath his feet had suddenly disappeared. He remembered Amy Reed's desperate pleas, her mention of her brother living on the colony, her warnings about children dying while they argued about paperwork and molecular signatures. Officer Kalen followed established protocol precisely. Commander Roth continued, his voice taking on a defensive tone. The documentation irregularities were legitimate concerns, and the safety of our sector cannot be compromised by emotional appeals or claims of emergency that cannot be immediately verified through proper channels. But even as his commander spoke the words that should have provided reassurance, Kalen found himself thinking about specific faces from the news footage, the grieving families, the overwhelmed medical staff, the small bodies being prepared for burial in the colony's hastily expanded cemetery, and somewhere among them, quite possibly, the brother that Amy Reed had mentioned. The humans are demanding a review of our checkpoint procedures, Commander Roth announced, bringing Kalen's attention back to the briefing. They claim our regulations are too rigid and don't account for genuine humanitarian emergencies, but we cannot allow political pressure to undermine the security systems that protect this entire sector. After the briefing ended, Kalen returned to his workstation but found himself unable to concentrate on the routine tasks that normally provided structure to his day. Every time he tried to focus on documentation reviews or security screenings, his mind wandered back to the news footage and the growing realization that his decision might have directly contributed to those deaths. His colleague, Officer Dale, approached his desk during the afternoon shift change with an expression of concerned curiosity. The humans are really pushing hard on this diplomatic complaint thing. They're claiming that 900 deaths could have been prevented if we'd shown more flexibility in our interpretation of the regulations. The regulations exist for valid security reasons, Kalen replied, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. We cannot make exceptions based on emotional appeals because that would create precedents that criminals and smugglers could exploit in the future. Sure, but 900 people, Kalen, Dale said quietly. That's more casualties than we've prevented through security enforcement in the past 5 years combined. Makes you wonder if maybe there's a balance we're missing somewhere in our approach to these situations. That evening, alone in his quarters, Kalen accessed the complete news coverage of the New Haven colony outbreak and forced himself to watch every detail. The reports included interviews with survivors, medical personnel, describing their desperate attempts to save lives with inadequate supplies, and family members mourning loved ones who might have lived if the medicine had arrived on schedule. One interview particularly haunted him, a young human male who had lost his sister in the outbreak, describing how she had sent him messages during her final days expressing hope that the medical supplies would arrive in time. The man's name was David Reed, and Kalen realized with growing horror that this must be Amy's brother, the one she had mentioned during their confrontation at the checkpoint. She kept saying that help was coming, David Reed told the reporter, his voice breaking with grief. She believed right up until the end that someone was bringing the medicine that would save everyone. She never gave up hope, even when the infection was spreading faster than our medical team could handle. Kalen turned off the news feed and sat, in the darkness of his quarters, trying to process the emotional weight of what he was experiencing. Throughout his career, he had prided himself on making decisions based on logic and established procedure rather than being swayed by emotional manipulation. But now he was beginning to understand that his rigid adherence to protocol might have blinded him to the actual consequences of his choices. Over the following days, the diplomatic pressure continued to mount as human representatives demanded changes to Altarian border procedures. News outlets across multiple species began covering the story, with many commentators questioning whether the current security systems were actually protecting anyone or simply creating unnecessary barriers to legitimate emergency assistance. The review board that Commander Roth had mentioned began its investigation, interviewing personnel from the station and examining the specific procedures that had been followed in Amy Reed's case. Kalen provided his testimony with the same precision he applied to all his duties, but he found himself struggling to defend decisions that had once seemed obviously correct. Did you consider the possibility that the documentation irregularities might have been caused by legitimate last-minute changes to the medical supplies, the review board chairman asked during Kalen's testimony. The human diplomatic representatives have provided evidence that research facilities often reformulate medications when dealing with specific bacterial strains. The regulations require complete documentation, regardless of the explanation provided. Kalen replied, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Security cannot be maintained if exceptions are made based on unverified claims, even those that appear to be supported by reasonable explanations. But given the specific nature of the emergency and the potentially catastrophic consequences of delay, did you consider any alternative approaches that might have balanced security? Concerns with humanitarian needs. The chairman pressed Kalen realized that he had no good answer to that question, because the truth was that he had not considered alternatives. His training had taught him to follow established procedures without deviation, and he had never been encouraged to think creatively about situations that didn't fit neatly into the predetermined categories of acceptable and unacceptable behavior. The investigation concluded with a recommendation that border procedures be modified to include emergency protocols for verified humanitarian situations, but Kalen himself received no formal censure for his actions. According to the official report, he had followed existing regulations correctly and could not be held responsible for the tragic consequences that resulted from applying those regulations as written. However, the lack of official punishment did nothing to alleviate the growing sense of responsibility and regret that had begun to consume Kalen's thoughts. He had always believed that following the rules was inherently virtuous, but now he was beginning to understand that rules without compassion could be just as destructive as chaos without order. As news of the procedural changes spread throughout the station, Kalen found himself increasingly isolated from his colleagues. Some supported the modifications as necessary improvements, while others viewed them as dangerous concessions to human emotional manipulation, and Kalen's role in precipitating the changes made him a controversial figure regardless of which side people supported. 3 weeks after the New Haven colony tragedy, a message arrived at Orbital Station Gamma 7 that would set in motion events beyond anything Kalen could have anticipated. The message was brief and formal, requesting information about shipping, schedules, and security procedures, but it was signed by Amy Reed, and Kalen knew that sooner or later he would have to face the consequences of his decision in ways that went far beyond diplomatic reviews and procedural modifications. The transport vessel Meridian cut through the darkness between stars carrying a cargo of routine administrative personnel transfers, but hidden among the legitimate passengers were 3 individuals whose presence would transform this mundane journey into something far more dangerous. Victor Strand, a notorious smuggler whose operations Kalen had disrupted 6 months earlier, had been planning his revenge with the patience of a predator stalking prey. Kalen settled into his assigned seat near the rear of the passenger compartment, reviewing the files for his new assignment at Border Station Delta 9. The transfer had been presented as a promotion, recognition for his handling of increasingly complex security situations, but part of him suspected it might also be an attempt to move him away from the controversy surrounding the New Haven colony incident. Attention passengers, we will be entering hyperspace in approximately 10 minutes, the pilot announced over the ship's communication system. Please ensure all personal items are secured and remain in your seats until we reach our destination. The hyperspace transition proceeded normally at first, but 17 minutes into the jump, emergency alarms began blaring throughout the ship. As critical systems started failing one by one, the artificial gravity flickered, emergency lighting activated, and the unmistakable smell of burning electronics filled the passenger compartment. Mayday, Mayday! This is Transport Meridian declaring an emergency. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, barely audible, above the sounds of failing machinery. We have multiple system failures and are preparing for emergency exit from hyperspace. All passengers prepare for rough deceleration. The ship lurched violently as it dropped out of hyperspace, throwing passengers against their safety restraints as the pilot fought to maintain control. Through the small viewport beside his seat, Kalen could see the surface of an unknown planet rushing up to meet them, its barren landscape offering little hope for a gentle landing. Victor Strand smiled grimly from his seat near the front of the compartment as the sabotage he had carefully orchestrated began to bear fruit. The electromagnetic pulse device hidden in his luggage had damaged the ship's navigation and communication systems, precisely as planned, ensuring that even if anyone survived the crash, they would be stranded and unable to call for help. The impact came with tremendous force, throwing Kalen against the bulkhead despite his safety harness and filling his vision with flashing lights and spinning metal debris. When consciousness returned, he found himself trapped in the twisted wreckage of what had once been the passenger compartment, his left leg pinned beneath a collapsed support beam. Emergency power provided dim lighting that revealed the full extent of the disaster around him. Most of the passengers had not survived the crash, their bodies scattered throughout the debris field that stretched for several hundred meters across the rocky surface of the planet. Kalen managed to free himself from the wreckage after nearly an hour of painful effort, but his injured leg made movement extremely difficult. His emergency beacon had been damaged in the crash, and the ship's main communication array was completely destroyed, leaving him with no way to signal for rescue. The planet's surface was hostile and unwelcoming, with jagged rocks, sparse vegetation, and an atmosphere that was breathable but filled with dust particles that made every breath a struggle. Temperature readings from his suit indicated that nightfall would bring freezing, conditions that could kill an injured person within hours. As Kalen began searching through the wreckage for supplies and other survivors, he discovered evidence that the crash had not been accidental. Fragments of electronic components that clearly didn't belong to the ship's original systems, along with the discovery of Victor Strand's body clutching a remote detonation device. "You finally figured it out," a voice called from behind a pile of twisted metal, and Kalen turned to see two men emerging from concealment with weapons drawn. Victor wanted to handle this personally, but since he didn't make it through the crash, we'll have to settle for finishing his work. The criminals had survived the impact better than most passengers because they had been prepared for it, wearing additional protective gear and positioning themselves in the most structurally sound part of the ship. Now they intended to eliminate the last witness to their sabotage operation before making their own escape. Kalen's injured leg prevented him from running, but years of security training had taught him how to use terrain and debris as cover. He dove behind a large piece of the ship's hull just as the first energy blast scorched the ground where he had been standing. "You cost Victor millions of credits in lost business when you shut down his smuggling routes," one of the assassins shouted as they advanced on his position. "He spent months planning this revenge, and we're not leaving here until you're dead." The cat-and-mouse game continued for several hours as Kalen used his knowledge of tactics and the assassin's overconfidence to stay one step ahead of capture. However, his injury was slowing him down, and the approaching nightfall would soon eliminate his advantages in this deadly game. During a brief lull in the pursuit, Kalen managed to activate his suit's long-range distress transmitter, though he knew the signal was probably too weak to reach any inhabited systems. The planet appeared to be in an unexplored region of space, far from regular shipping routes or patrol areas. Night brought not only freezing temperatures but also the emergence of the planet's indigenous predators. Large, wolf-like creatures with glowing eyes began stalking through the crash site, drawn by the scent of blood and the sounds of human activity. The assassins found themselves facing a more immediate threat than their intended victim, as the predators attacked without warning. Kalen heard screams and weapons fire from their position, followed by an ominous silence that suggested the planet's wildlife had claimed at least some of his pursuers. Wounded and exhausted, Kalen took shelter in a partially intact section of the ship's cargo hold, using emergency heating elements to ward off hypothermia. His medical supplies were limited. An infection from his leg wound was becoming an increasingly serious concern. Hours passed in a haze of pain and intermittent consciousness as Kalen struggled to maintain his body temperature and treat his injuries with the limited resources available. The predators continued to prowl the area around the crash site, their haunting howls serving as a constant reminder of how precarious his survival had become. Dawn brought little improvement in his situation, as the planet's twin suns created scorching daytime temperatures that were almost as dangerous as the freezing nights. Kalen's water supply was running dangerously low, and his emergency rations would last no more than 2 or 3 days. On the second day after the crash, Kalen detected movement in the sky above the crash site. A small cargo vessel was conducting what appeared to be a search pattern, possibly investigating the distress signal he had managed to transmit before his equipment failed. The ship was too far away for him to signal effectively, and his damaged beacon wasn't powerful enough to guarantee detection. Kalen watched helplessly as the vessel completed its search pattern and began to move away, apparently having failed to locate any signs of survivors. But the ship's pilot was more thorough than Kalen had realized, and after several hours the vessel returned for a more detailed examination of the crash site. This time it landed nearby, and a single figure in an environmental suit began walking toward the wreckage. As the figure approached, Kalen recognized the distinctive markings on the environmental suit and realized with shock that his potential rescuer was Amy Reed, the human pilot whose emergency medical transport he had delayed at the checkpoint. The irony was almost overwhelming. The woman whose brother had died because of his rigid adherence to protocol was now in a position to determine whether he lived or died. Amy had detected his distress signal while passing through the sector on a routine cargo run, and despite everything that had happened between them, her instinct had been to investigate and offer assistance. Now she stood looking down at him through the faceplate of her helmet, and Kalen could see the conflict in her eyes as she recognized who he was. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible through his damaged suit radio. "I know you have every reason to leave me here, but I need help." For a long moment, Amy said nothing, and Kalen wondered if she would simply turn around and leave him to die on this hostile world. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of all the lives that had been lost because of his decision at the checkpoint, and he realized that his survival now depended entirely on whether she could find forgiveness in her heart for the man who had failed her when she needed help the most. Amy stared down at the wounded Altarian officer through her helmet visor, her mind racing with conflicting emotions that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Every instinct told her to turn around and leave him to face the same kind of helplessness that the colonists on New Haven had experienced, but something deeper in her nature refused to let her abandon another living being to suffer and die. "You remember me, don't you?" she said finally, her voice carrying through the suit radio with a mixture of anger and resignation. "Amy Reed, the pilot whose emergency medical transport you delayed while people were dying on New Haven Colony?" Kalen nodded weakly, unable to meet her eyes through the reflective surface of her helmet. "I remember, and I know that you have every right to leave me here after what my decision cost your people." The honesty in his response surprised Amy, who had expected denials or attempts to justify his actions. She knelt beside him and began examining his injuries with the practiced efficiency of someone who had provided emergency aid in remote locations throughout her career as a cargo pilot. "Your leg is badly damaged and you're showing signs of infection," she announced after completing her initial assessment. "Without proper medical treatment, you'll be dead within 48 hours, maybe less if those predators decide to come back during daylight." Kalen closed his eyes and tried to prepare himself for what he assumed would be her inevitable decision to leave him behind. After everything that had happened, he couldn't blame her for choosing revenge over mercy, and part of him felt that dying on this desolate planet might be appropriate justice for his role in the tragedy. "I should let you die here," Amy said quietly, confirming his expectations. "My brother David spent his last days believing that help was coming, that someone cared enough to bring the medicine that would save him and all the others, but your paperwork and protocols were more important than human lives." The pain in her voice was worse than any physical injury Kalen had ever experienced, and he realized that his rigid adherence to regulations had not just caused deaths, but had also destroyed the faith and hope of people who had trusted in the basic decency of others. David Reed had died believing that help was on the way, never knowing that bureaucratic inflexibility had doomed him and hundreds of others. "But I can't become the kind of person who abandons someone in need," Amy continued, her voice strengthening with resolve. "That would make me just as cold and heartless as the system that killed my brother, so I'm going to help you survive, but don't mistake this for forgiveness." Amy helped Kalen to his feet and supported him as they made their way slowly toward her ship, stopping frequently to rest as his injured leg made every step a painful ordeal. The cargo vessel was small, but well equipped for long-distance travel, with medical supplies that could stabilize his condition until they could reach proper facilities. The core nearest inhabited system is 6 days away, Amy explained as she helped him into the ship's small medical bay. But my communication array is showing some kind of interference that's blocking long-range transmissions, so we're on our own until we can figure out what's causing the problem. As Amy began treating his injuries with antibiotics and regenerative therapy, Kalen found himself studying her face and trying to understand the strength of character that allowed her to help someone who had caused her so much pain. Her movements were gentle but efficient, and despite her obvious anger, she showed genuine concern for his welfare. "Why are you really doing this?" he asked during a pause in her medical treatment. "You could have easily justified leaving me to die, and no one would have questioned your decision given what happened at the checkpoint." Amy was quiet for several minutes before answering, her hands continuing to work on his injured leg while she considered her response. "Because the moment I start making decisions about who deserves to live or die based on their past actions, I become exactly what I hate about the system that failed New Haven Colony." "Your brother would be proud of your choice," Kalen said softly, and immediately regretted the words when he saw the flash of pain that crossed Amy's face. "Don't," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the ship's quiet atmosphere like a blade. "Don't you dare try to use my brother's memory to make yourself feel better about what you did. He's dead because you cared more about following rules than saving lives." The conversation ended abruptly as the ship's proximity alarms began blaring, indicating that something large was approaching their position. Amy rushed to the pilot's station and activated the external sensors, revealing 3 heavily armed vessels closing in on their location, with clear hostile intent. "Those are the same ships that were in the area when the transport was sabotaged," Kalen realized as he recognized the energy signatures on the scanner display. "The criminals who wanted me dead must have survived the crash and called for backup." Amy's fingers flew across the control interface as she powered up the ship's engines and defensive systems. "Well, they're about to get their chance to finish what they started, because my cargo hauler isn't equipped for combat against 3 military-grade attack ships." The first energy blasts rocked the ship before Amy could complete the startup sequence, sending warning lights flashing across every control panel. She managed to get the engines online and pulled away from the planet's surface, but the attacking vessels were faster and better armed than her civilian craft. "Can you handle weapon systems?" Amy asked as another barrage of enemy fire shook the ship violently. "I need to focus on flying or we're both going to die in the next few minutes." Despite his injuries, Kalen dragged himself to the weapons control station and began charging. The ship's defensive array, his tactical training from his military service before joining border enforcement, gave him insights into combat strategy that complemented Amy's piloting skills. "Target their communication array first," he advised as Amy maneuvered through a complex series of evasive maneuvers. "If we can prevent them from coordinating their attacks, we might be able to deal with them one at a time." The battle raged for nearly an hour as Amy pushed her ship to its absolute limits while Kalen provided covering fire and tactical analysis. Their teamwork improved gradually as they learned to anticipate each other's actions and coordinate their responses to the enemy's attack patterns. "I'm reading massive structural damage on the lead ship," Kalen announced as one of his shots found its target. "But the other 2 are moving to flank us, and our shields are down to 30%. Amy spotted a dense asteroid field on the edge of the system and made a desperate decision to use the rocky debris as cover. "Hold on, this is going to get rough," she warned as she plunged the ship into the maze of floating stones and metal fragments. The pursuing vessels followed them into the asteroid field, but their larger size and military configuration made them less maneuverable in the confined space. Amy used her experience with difficult flying conditions to weave between obstacles that forced their attackers to slow down and separate. There, Kalen pointed to a cluster of particularly large asteroids that formed a natural bottleneck. If we can lure them through that passage one at a time, we might be able to even the odds. Amy's piloting skills and Kaylin's tactical knowledge proved to be an effective combination as they systematically eliminated their pursuers. The first ship was destroyed when Amy led it into a collision with a massive asteroid, while the second fell victim to concentrated weapons fire as it tried to navigate the narrow passage. The final enemy vessel retreated when its captain realized that the hunt had become too costly. Amy and Kaylin watched it disappear into hyperspace, leaving them alone among the asteroids with a severely damaged ship and dwindling supplies. "We make a good team," Amy admitted grudgingly as they began assessing the damage to her ship. "Your tactical experience probably saved both our lives during that fight." "Your flying kept us alive long enough for tactics to matter," Kaylin replied, and for the first time since the crash he saw something other than anger in her expression. As they worked together to repair the ship's critical systems, both of them began to understand that survival would require them to put aside their personal history and focus on their common goal. The criminals who had tried to kill them were still out there, and the interference blocking their communication suggested that the threat was far from over. "I still can't forgive you for what happened to my brother," Amy said as they completed temporary repairs to the navigation system. "But I'm beginning to understand that maybe you're not the same person who made that decision at the checkpoint." Kaylin looked at her with genuine gratitude, knowing that her willingness to work with him despite everything that had happened represented a kind of grace that he had never encountered before. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope that someday I can find a way to honor your brother's memory by doing better." The ship limped away from the asteroid field toward the nearest inhabited system, carrying two people who had learned that survival sometimes requires unlikely alliances and that redemption might be possible even in the darkest circumstances. Neither of them knew what challenges lay ahead, but they had taken the first steps toward understanding each other as something more than enemy and victim. 3 days into their journey toward the nearest inhabited system, Amy discovered something in her ship's data logs that changed everything they thought they knew about the attack. Hidden among the routine diagnostic files was evidence of sophisticated surveillance equipment that had been monitoring their communications and tracking their movements for weeks before the ambush. "This isn't random criminal revenge," Amy announced as she examined the encrypted data packets that the surveillance system had been transmitting. "Someone has been watching both of us for a long time, and they knew exactly where we'd be and when we'd be there." Kaylin studied the technical readouts with growing alarm as he recognized the signatures of military-grade intelligence-gathering equipment. This level of coordination requires resources and connections that go far beyond what smugglers and black market criminals typically have access to. The ship's communication array finally cleared the interference that had been blocking their transmissions, but instead of relief, the restored contact brought disturbing news from multiple sources. Border stations throughout the sector were reporting coordinated attacks on security personnel, supply convoys, and diplomatic facilities. "It's a systematic operation designed to destabilize the entire border region," Kaylin realized as he reviewed the attack reports. "The criminals who tried to kill us are part of something much larger than personal revenge. They're trying to collapse the security infrastructure that maintains peace between our species." Amy pulled up star charts showing the locations of recent attacks and overlaid them with shipping routes and diplomatic installations. The pattern that emerged revealed a carefully planned campaign to disrupt trade relationships and create the kind of chaos that would allow criminal organizations to operate without interference. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a cluster of incidents near the core systems. "Every major checkpoint between human and Altarian space has been hit within the past 2 weeks, and the timing suggests they're building up to something even bigger." A priority message appeared on their communication screen bearing the emergency codes that indicated immediate threat to civilian populations. The transmission came from Border, Station Alpha 1, the primary coordination center for the entire sector, and the voice of Commander Hayes carried barely controlled panic. "All available security personnel respond immediately to Alpha 1. The message began. "We are under direct assault by unknown forces using advanced weaponry and insider intelligence. Civilian evacuation is in progress, but we need immediate reinforcement to prevent total facility loss. Kalen recognized the tactical implications immediately as his military training kicked in. Alpha 1 controls the communication networks and navigation systems for the entire sector. If it falls, the criminals will be able to operate freely while legitimate traffic becomes impossible to coordinate. The nearest military response units are at least 2 days away. Amy calculated based on current fleet positions. By the time help arrives, the station will either be destroyed or completely under criminal control. Despite the obvious danger, both of them understood that they were possibly the only people in position to provide assistance before the situation became irreversible. Amy's ship was fast and maneuverable, while Kalen's knowledge of station security systems and criminal tactics made him invaluable for planning an effective response. "We can't fight an entire criminal fleet with one cargo hauler," Amy pointed out as she began plotting a course toward Alpha 1. "But maybe we can gather intelligence about their operation and find a way to disrupt their coordination." Kalen accessed the station's security protocols and began identifying potential vulnerabilities that the attackers might exploit. The main weakness is the central computer core that controls all automated defenses. If they can take control of that system, they'll be able to turn the station's own weapons against the defenders. As they approached the embattled station, the scope of the criminal operation became clear through long-range sensors. More than 20 attack vessels surrounded Alpha 1, methodically destroying defensive systems while boarding parties fought their way through the station's corridors. There, Kalen pointed to a small maintenance shaft that connected to the station's secondary computer access point. "If we can get inside through that service tunnel, we might be able to reach the core systems before the attackers realize what we're doing." Amy's piloting skills were tested to their absolute limit as she maneuvered through the battle zone while avoiding detection by the criminal fleet. Energy blasts from the ongoing fight illuminated space around them as she used the chaos of combat to mask their approach to the maintenance shaft. "I'm reading multiple hull breaches and life support failures throughout the station," Amy reported, as her sensors analyzed the extent of the damage. "Even if we can retake the computer core, there might not be enough of the station left to save." The docking procedure was complicated by battle damage that had twisted the maintenance shaft's alignment, but Amy managed to achieve a seal that would allow them to enter the station. Kalen armed himself with weapons from the ship's emergency locker, while Amy grabbed portable computer equipment that could interface with the station's systems. Inside the station, emergency lighting cast eerie shadows through corridors filled with smoke and debris from the ongoing battle. Bodies of both defenders and attackers lay scattered throughout the areas they traversed, silent testimony to the ferocity of the fighting that had raged for hours. "The computer core is 3 levels down," Kalen whispered as they moved through the damaged passages. "But we'll have to get past at least 2 criminal positions that are blocking the main access routes." Amy's technical skills proved invaluable as they encountered security doors that had been sealed during the emergency lockdown. Her portable equipment allowed them to bypass the damaged access controls and continue toward their objective while avoiding the main battle zones. "I'm detecting at least 6 hostiles in the computer core chamber," Kalen reported as they reached the final checkpoint. "They're probably trying to crack the security codes that will give them control of the station's defensive systems." The assault on the computer core required perfect coordination between Amy's technical expertise and Kalen's tactical knowledge. While he provided covering fire and strategic direction, she worked frantically to prevent the criminals from completing their infiltration of the station's control systems. "They've already gained access to the weapons array," Amy announced as she fought to regain control of the compromised systems. "I can lock them out temporarily, but they'll break through again unless we can physically prevent them from reaching the backup terminals." The battle in the computer core lasted for nearly an hour as wave after wave of criminal reinforcements tried to retake the critical facility. Kalen's military experience and Amy's determination created a defensive partnership that held off superior numbers through clever use of the room's technical equipment and defensive positions. "I've got communications back online," Amy reported, during a brief lull in the fighting. "And I'm sending a distress signal with our location and the intelligence we've gathered about the criminal operation." The information they transmitted included detailed analysis of the attackers' equipment, tactics, and coordination methods, and more importantly, Amy had managed to download files from the criminals' own computer systems that revealed the full scope of their operation and identified the corrupt officials who had been providing inside information military response units are acknowledging. Our transmission, Kalen announced as he monitored the communication channels. Fleet Admiral Ross confirms that strike groups are en route and will arrive within 6 hours. But 6 hours was an eternity in their current situation. As the criminal forces continued their assault on the computer core with increasing desperation, the attackers knew that losing control of the station would expose their entire operation and lead to the arrest of their Confederates throughout the sector. "They're bringing up heavy weapons," Amy warned as her sensors detected energy signatures that indicated military-grade assault equipment. "The blast doors won't hold against that kind of firepower for more than a few minutes." Kalen made a decision that surprised both of them as he activated the station's emergency self-destruct sequence. "If we can't hold the core, we'll make sure they can't use it either. The destruction of Alpha 1 will send a message that this kind of coordinated attack won't be tolerated." "Wait," Amy said as she spotted something in the criminal communication intercepts. "They're not just trying to control the station, they're planning to use it as a base for attacking civilian shipping in the core systems. If we can disrupt their coordination now, we might be able to prevent a much larger tragedy." Her words reminded Kalen of the lesson he had learned on New Haven Colony about the difference between following procedures and protecting lives. Instead of destroying the station, he began implementing a more sophisticated plan that would turn the criminals' own tactics against them. Working together with desperate efficiency, Amy and Kalen managed to use the station's communication systems to send false orders to the criminal fleet. The coordinated attack began to break down as individual ship captains received conflicting instructions and started to suspect that their operation had been compromised. When the military response fleet finally arrived, they found the criminal vessels scattered and disorganized. Many of the attackers surrendered immediately, rather than face coordinated resistance from fresh military units, while others fled into hyperspace to avoid capture. The intelligence you gathered has broken open the largest criminal conspiracy in this sector's history, Fleet Admiral Ross informed them during the debriefing. Corrupt officials in at least 7 different systems have been arrested based on the evidence you recovered. As they stood together in the damaged computer core surrounded by the aftermath of their unlikely partnership, Amy and Kalen realized that their shared ordeal had created something neither of them had expected. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual respect that transcended their personal history and pointed toward the possibility of a different kind of future. 6 months after the battle at Border Station Alpha 1, Kalen stood before the interspecies tribunal wearing civilian clothes instead of his border enforcement uniform. The hearing chamber was filled with representatives from multiple species, journalists and family members of those who had died in the New Haven colony outbreak, creating an atmosphere of tension that made every breath feel heavy. This tribunal has been convened to examine the actions of former border officer Kalen during the medical emergency transport incident that resulted in significant loss of life on New Haven colony, announced Chief Arbiter Morgan, her voice carrying the weight of official authority. The purpose of these proceedings is to determine appropriate accountability and to establish improved protocols for similar situations in the future, Amy. Reed sat in the witness section, her presence both surprising and significant given her role in the events that had led to this moment. Over the past months, she had become an unexpected advocate for reforming border procedures, working with officials from multiple species to develop new emergency protocols. Officer Kalen, the chief arbiter continued, you stand accused of negligent enforcement of regulations that directly contributed to the deaths of 847 sentient beings on New Haven colony. How do you respond to these charges? Kalen stood slowly, his posture reflecting the weight of responsibility he had carried since learning the full consequences of his decision. I accept full responsibility for my actions and their results. My rigid adherence to protocol without consideration for the humanitarian consequences was wrong, and I make no excuses for the tragedy that followed. The honesty and directness of his response created a stir throughout the hearing chamber. as many had expected him to defend his actions or attempt to shift blame to the regulatory system. Instead, he continued with a detailed explanation of his thought process and the failures in judgment that had led to his decision. I believed that following established procedures was inherently virtuous and that exceptions to regulations would create dangerous precedents. Kalen continued, I failed to consider that rules without compassion could be just as destructive as chaos without order, and that failure cost hundreds of innocent lives. The prosecution presented their case with methodical precision, documenting the timeline of events and the preventable nature of the tragedy. Medical experts testified that the delayed arrival of antibiotics had directly caused deaths that could have been avoided if the supplies had reached New Haven Colony within the original time frame. The evidence clearly shows that Officer Kalen's inflexible interpretation of border security protocols created an unnecessary delay that resulted in mass casualties, the prosecutor argued. This case demonstrates the need for accountability when bureaucratic rigidity causes preventable harm to civilian populations. When Amy was called to testify, her words carried special weight because of her personal connection to the tragedy and her subsequent experiences with Kalen. The hearing chamber fell silent as she approached the witness stand, knowing that her testimony could determine the outcome of the proceedings. 6 months ago, I wanted nothing more than to see Officer Kalen punished for his role in my brother's death. Amy began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. David died believing that help was coming, that someone cared enough to bring the medicine that would save him and the other colonists. She paused to compose herself before continuing with testimony that would surprise everyone present. But I've learned that vengeance and justice are not the same thing, and that true accountability requires more than punishment. It requires genuine change and efforts to prevent similar tragedies. Amy described the events on the crashed planet and their subsequent cooperation during the criminal conspiracy investigation. Her account emphasized Kalen's evolution from rigid rule follower to someone who understood the human cost of bureaucratic inflexibility. The man who saved my life and helped prevent a sector-wide crisis is not the same person who delayed my medical transport, she testified. He has shown genuine remorse, accepted responsibility, and taken concrete actions to address the flaws in thinking that led to the original tragedy. The defense presented evidence of Kalen's voluntary resignation from border enforcement and his subsequent work with humanitarian organizations. Character witnesses described his efforts to improve emergency response protocols and his personal visits to families affected by the New Haven Colony outbreak. Former Officer Kalen has spent the past 6 months working without compensation to develop new procedures that balance security concerns with humanitarian needs, his attorney argued. His actions demonstrate genuine commitment to preventing similar tragedies rather than simply avoiding personal consequences. During the recess, Kalen and Amy spoke privately for the first time since the tribunal began. Their conversation revealed the complex relationship that had developed between them through shared trauma and mutual respect. "Why are you defending me?" Kalen asked, genuinely puzzled by her support. "You have every right to demand the harshest possible punishment for what I did to your brother and the other colonists." Amy looked at him with an expression that combined sadness with something approaching understanding. Because David wouldn't want his death to be used for revenge. He believed in people's ability to grow and change, and I think he would approve of what you're trying to become. When the tribunal reconvened for final arguments and sentencing, Chief Arbiter Morgan announced a decision that reflected both the severity of the original offense and the genuine efforts at redemption that had followed. This tribunal finds former Officer Kalen responsible for negligent enforcement that contributed to the New Haven Colony tragedy. However, she continued, we also recognize the genuine remorse, acceptance of responsibility, and constructive actions that have characterized his response to these events. Therefore, this tribunal sentences him to 5 years of supervised community service working with interspecies humanitarian organizations. The sentence included requirements for Kalen to continue his work developing emergency protocols and to participate in educational programs designed to prevent similar bureaucratic failures. More importantly, it represented official recognition That redemption was possible even after serious failures in judgment. 1 year later, Kalen stood on the rebuilt New Haven colony delivering medical supplies as part of his community service assignment. The settlement had been reconstructed with improved medical facilities and emergency supply systems designed to prevent future tragedies. Amy now served as the colony's director of emergency services, having left her career as a cargo pilot to focus on disaster preparedness and interspecies cooperation. Their professional relationship had evolved into something resembling friendship, built on shared commitment to preventing others from experiencing similar losses. The new emergency protocols have been adopted by 17 different systems, Amy reported as they reviewed the supply distribution records. Your work with the Humanitarian Council is making a real difference in how border emergencies are handled. Kalen nodded with satisfaction that came not from personal recognition, but from knowing that his efforts were creating positive change. David would be proud of what you've built here. This colony has become a model for interspecies cooperation and emergency preparedness. He would also be proud of you, Amy replied, her words carrying the weight of genuine forgiveness. You've shown that people can learn from their worst mistakes and use that knowledge to help others. The memorial garden at the center of New Haven Colony contained names of all those who had died in the original outbreak, including David Reed's inscription. Kalen visited the memorial regularly during his service assignments, not out of guilt, but out of commitment to honoring their memory through positive action. As the sun set over the rebuilt colony, Amy and Kalen worked together to finalize the emergency supply protocols that would ensure no other settlement would face the same kind of tragedy that had originally brought them together. Their collaboration represented proof that redemption was possible, and that even the worst failures could become the foundation for meaningful change. Do you think we've made enough difference? Kalen asked, as they completed their work for the day. Amy looked around at the thriving colony with its improved infrastructure and emergency systems, then at the memorial garden where families came to remember their lost loved ones. We can never bring back the people who died because of bureaucratic failures, but we can make sure their deaths weren't meaningless by preventing similar tragedies in the future. Their unlikely partnership had become a symbol throughout the sector of how individuals could overcome personal history and work together for the greater good. The story of the border officer and the cargo pilot was told in diplomatic circles as an example of how accountability and forgiveness could create positive change. Years later, when new officers were trained for border enforcement duties, they studied the New Haven colony case as a critical example of how rigid adherence to protocol without consideration for humanitarian consequences could have devastating results. The training programs emphasized the importance of balancing security concerns with compassion and common sense. Kalen's transformation from inflexible bureaucrat to humanitarian advocate proved that redemption was possible for those willing to accept responsibility and work to address the harm they had caused. His story became a reminder that true accountability required not just punishment, but genuine efforts to prevent similar failures and honor the memory of those who had suffered.